Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I just forgot that today is a meeting because we have holidays nowadays. So
Oh, yeah.
I was playing something, then I just came back and submitted the proposal, and all of a sudden I got your message. So
Good.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah. So everything is on track then. You have everything submitted.
Yeah. So,
Good.
but I was not like understanding how they will understand. Like I have submitted a proposal to INCF, but they did not ask for like project number which that you're submitting to.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if they did that last year either. I think if it's like there are multiple proposals from a organization, they put in like the name of it. But all they need from me is like I need to claim it as like willing to mentor. So I'll see like all the proposals for this one. I mean, it'll be clear what they are. So I'll just select those people on my end, and then it'll be associated. So it's not a problem.
So I have the like titles very clear, like project 16 and all, so I think it should be okay.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's sometimes people like deviate strongly from the name of the project like the project call, which is a little difficult. But usually I can tell which ones are which. So,
Yeah,
hi Jesse. Yeah, it's you two are the only ones to like actually email me about this project. So, or contact me about like helping them with their proposal. So I probably may get a few more, but we'll it's like last year I had a lot of applicants for both. Or actually, how many? I think I had two projects last year. The one in DevaWorm had like 16 applicants, and this one had like 7 or 8. And so that's how this is sort of the genesis of this group was from that. And so this year in the DevaWorm group, I have 2 projects, and I've gotten probably about 12 applicants for both, like between the two. So that one's a bit more competitive. So, but we'll see how it shakes out when I get the applications.
yeah. I think we should be clear as I talk to you.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So, how are you, Jesse?
Morning. I'm a little bit under the weather. I'm not like sick in the corona way, but I'm just a little bit like a little like low energy day. But I'm okay. There's been plenty of stuff, going on and things, some things that you know about, and things that we talked about, like conferences and stuff like that. So I can get into that when the time comes. But I'm alright. How are you both doing?
I'm doing fine. Yeah.
I'm also good. I just played badminton and came back. So.
That's good.
So they have like closed the gates of our hostels. They are not allowing us to get outside the hall, but they are giving food and everything inside the hall. So in the mess, so all we need is food and Wi-Fi. So
yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. I guess people are doing all right so far. We'll see how things go, but yeah, we're all kind of like at the house here, and it's just going out for food or for groceries and things like that. So, but so let's see. Today we'll do. I'll do a couple papers as usual, and then we'll talk about the NeuroMatch Conference, which is coming up this early, like Monday and Tuesday of this week. And then I'll share a little bit of what I'm going to present there for a presentation. I don't have the schedule yet. And then we'll talk about, and maybe like Jesse could share his, at least the abstract. And then the epistemological directories presentation for CSV conf. We'll maybe revisit that a little bit. Like I said, for that, maybe next week we'll have an outline together on it. And that's just like what the kinds of things maybe you want to present in it. I mean, that's not a hard deadline, but I just wanted to give, I just want to make sure that we're keeping up with it. Because I know we have a lot of shorter deadlines in front of it. So, okay, so let me share my screen. I'll start presenting.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to come up. Okay. Okay, so these are papers from the reading queue that you get a reading queue, you say that's an interesting paper, and you put them in this folder, and you never look at them again. And so I'm doing this to kind of give some air to some of these papers. So the first paper is called Gamerism, and you'll see why. It's kind of a weird name. Probably guess what it is before I show you the paper. Okay. So this is abstract, very short. Examining games from a fresh perspective, we present the idea of game-inspired and game-based algorithms, dubbed gamerisms. Okay, so they start with a quote in French by Proust, and then they go on to talk about games, competition, and that sort of stuff. It has a very long history in human culture. And there's a very deep tradition of studying games in academic computer science. So, there's artificial intelligence where some of the first tests of a general AI was to play chess. And so they would have these machines play chess. And eventually, algorithms that played chess were able to beat grandmasters. And so then humans decided to try to flip the tables on the machines and use machines in combination with human strategy and beat the machines again. But the machines may, in fact, beat that strategy again. Actually, the strategy combining humans and machines, it's called what is it? I can't remember the actual name. I gave a presentation on this at one time. Centaur, because the centaur is half man, half animal. This is half man, half machine. That sort of idea. And so, or human, that's, that sort of combination of machines and human strategy is now actually an active area of research. In any case, there are a lot of ways that you can study games. So they focus on computational intelligence, what they call computational intelligence in this paper. And games alone admits at least 10 broad areas. So they actually walk through 10 areas where you can apply games research to computational intelligence. And that is a non-player character, behavior learning, search and planning, player modeling, games as AI benchmarks, procedural content generation, computational narrative, believable agents, AI-assisted game design, general game AI, and AI in commercial games. So they're focusing a lot on sort of allied to maybe video games and other applications of AI. I think actually that there is a lot broader application of games. There's game theory, of course, which you can use to model competition and cooperation and things like that. But you also have games that you can, you've heard of gamification. That's like taking maybe an piece of educational content and turning it into a game. or like some sort of task, like classifying images of something and turning it into a game. So people can go and play this game, but they're actually classifying images. They've done that in cancer research, for example, where you have imaging data from like some imaging modality, and you have people play this game where they identify different features in the image. And so that's all possible too, but they don't talk about that so much in this paper. Actually, they do talk about beyond AI/CI, there are many other areas of game research: game theory, social and psychological analysis, historical investigations, and so forth. So then they talk about algorithms, and in this context, they give a definition for algorithm, which is an algorithm is an abstract recipe prescribing a process that might be carried out by a human, by a computer, or by other means. And so they basically describe an algorithm in that way, and then they get into this review. So they talk about it a bit. They establish. They talk about gamification, actually. So what about gamification? The application of game design elements and game principles in non-game contexts. Gamification is another very broad area. So they actually talk about that. They talk about game rhythms being simulation games. And this is a simulation game is like a video game or a real-life role-play game. The object is to simulate real-world activities, not solve problems. But you can apply game, like the study of games, to these problems. And so actually, in terms of video games, they're talking about flight simulators. So there of course are video games that are not that sort of flight simulator type game, and those are the kind of games they're interested in. Why not take an NP-complete problem and transform it into a puzzle? So this question was posed in an earlier survey of NP-complete puzzles. And so this is an astute step in the game-rhythmic direction, though our net is cast wider, with our interest going beyond NP-complete problems and beyond puzzles. So if you don't know what NP-complete means, if you have a beat on theoretical computer science, and maybe you've heard about it if you don't, but the idea of NP problems and P problems, they come from this taxonomy of problem hardness. And so problems are categorized by how hard it is for them to be solved in a simple way. And so there's usually an algorithmic time that's associated with these kind of problems. It's the O2, time. So they have this metric where they measure the number of, the execution time of an algorithm. And so that's how they define problem hardness. And so you can have very easy problems that don't take much time at all. And then you have very difficult problems. They're usually combinatoric problems or some sort of search, a random search or something like that take very long periods of time. And so they're exponential periods of time. And so the exponential periods of time usually are classified as NP, or they could be even, there are other categories that go beyond NP, and I'm not going to cover those. Maybe I'll cover those in another session, but it's a pretty it's a pretty detailed taxonomy. If you look at if you go to a theoretical computer science book and you look it up, there are a huge number of categories for this, and people have been trying different ways to solve these kind of problems. Obviously, because we want to be able to solve them with a computer, but there are a lot of classes of problem for which conventional algorithms that we have now are not going to cut it. They're going to take a long time to solve the problem and get a rough approximation at best. So let's see. So they kind of go through this. They talk about some critiques here. They give a couple of problems. So they give like one problem is generate 2 random paths through a map with a single cross point. And so they suggest a game-arithmic solution for that. There's another one, graph coloring is an assignment of labels to an element of a graph subject to certain constraints. So this is a graph coloring problem. This problem is usually NP complete, although some special cases are polynomial time. Gamerism, 1950s, Claude Shannon invented an abstract, so they give a gamerism solution to this. The Shannon switching game. This is Claude Shannon's, one of his many inventions. And so they give an example again of something that gamearithmics might be able to solve. My impression of this paper is that they're, kind of giving this, they have this sort of, they're coming up with this method for applying games to larger scope of computer science problems, not just in games, but they're kind of drawing from like what's been done in games. So they propose a series of different games and solutions to some of these problems. So there's a Tetris-like game that they propose for one problem. Rush Hour, the board game Rush Hour, is another solution. So this is it's a very interesting paper. It has a different kind of take on like computer science problems. I don't know if people have really thought of it exactly in this way before, but as I said, there's a very strong history of applying games, or the idea of games, to computer science problems. I don't know if they've quite done it this way, though. So anyways, that's that paper. And then there are 2 papers I want to go through rather quickly, given their content, on the brain. So this is switching a little bit into neuroscience, and it's computational neuroscience, so it's not that much of a switch. But so this is discovering the computational relevance of brain network organization. And so this is where they look at what they call brain networks, which are, we offer a new framework for understanding the role of connectivity in cognition, network coding, encoding, and decoding models. These models utilize connectivity to specify the transfer of information via neural activity flow, successfully predicting the formation of cognitive representations in empirical neural data. So they're proposing that networks are the way to understand how the brain works. And of course, we've been kind of focusing on that with the Bradenberg vehicles, but there's a much broader literature on this. So recent advances in network neuroscience. So one of the areas is network neuroscience. And people have done this largely with fMRI data, but also with other types of data where they've extracted these networks. So it could be like a recording site, what they call a voxel, or like a brain region, which is an anatomical region. And they record activity for these areas. They, summarize the activity, and then that serves as a node in the network. And then the idea is to match different nodes across the brain with activity. So in other words, you could take your data and it would be organized by recording site and by time. And at every time you have a number of recording sites and they have a state. And the states that are similar at that period in time are considered to be connected. So you might have something like that where you have a dynamic network where at any one time there are 2 nodes that are basically co-activated, and so they have a link between each other. Or you might have a network where over time there's a correlation in their function. So like they're active and inactive at the same times. And so you might say those 2 things are highly correlated, there's a link. And then that's how you build your network. And so this is not a connectionist technique. This is very different from connectionism because you're taking data and you're saying you don't worry about like the you do apply a threshold to the potential patterns of connectivity, But you do have this sort of, you define your network in advance, and it's based on maybe like knowledge of some function, like memory or attention. We know there's certain areas of the brain involved in those things, so we take those areas and we measure them, and then we see what their relationship is. So it's different than connectionism. But then they go a little bit farther and they build network coding models, which are what they call function structure mappings. So network coding is where you have, you have some stimulus that goes into region X, it's encoded into region X, and then it's decoded into attention and motor functions. So this is a function structure mapping. Connectivity mapping is where you have different areas, there's a mapping from one area to another. And then the network coding model is a sort of a combination of those two. So you have task stimuli like faces and places, and feedback instructions from the environment. So if you think about how you memorize like a set of instructions or a set of objects or a set of locations, that's what this is doing. You're encoding a bunch of things from the environment, and it's encoded into this region. And then it's decoded into movements or into verbal answers or into actions. And so there's this region X, but really it can be, there's this network of things in the world and in the brain, but also there are probably networks within the brain which represent this region X as well. And so I think what they're doing here is they're taking like this idea of neural coding and like maybe extending it out into the environment or extending it to function. Because a lot of brain networks are, I can produce a brain network and I kind of know what areas of the brain do, but I don't know much about like what that means in terms of function. I only know the network changes over time, and I only know that there's like, activation in the brain. So when you hear people say that when I show them a face, the brain lights up. Brain lights up refers to like some neuroimaging study, thing where they get like some activation in an area, which is indirect activity, but it's not that informative to function. It's just like there's something happening in the brain when I do this, but it's not clear what that means in terms of function. And this sort of coding is actually maybe puts a little bit of flesh on those bones. Like if you see a brain network, you can kind of link it to things in the environment and then link it to actions outside of the network. So like, if I do something, there's intentionality. Is that caused by the state of the brain network, or are there things that are missing from our network, or is there some process that goes on, like a dynamical process that goes on for many minutes or hours that precede that action? Let's see. So they talk a little bit more about their model. So one possible way to gain mechanistic insight is to map relationships between neural entities, connectivity mapping. So that's the connectivity mapping is within the brain itself. And the goal is similar to constructing a causal map amongst functional components of a car. But there's no guarantee that it's causal. There's like there's a causality that's assumed sometimes in models of like, if you look at like the way people approach typical experiments, they say if I do this intervention, it has this effect. And there's this temptation to say that that's causal. But actually, that's not always the case. It's the case maybe that you make an intervention and it results in this thing, and we usually run a statistical test to say whether it's like that's that there's an association there, and maybe it's a little stronger than an association, but it's not necessarily causal. And I don't know if they mention it in this paper, but there's a whole field of like how to figure out, their causal models where they're very complex causal models where people have tried to figure out if some relationship is causal or not. It's not just as simple as saying there's a cause and effect. that you can observe casually. And it's certainly not in a network where you're mapping between sites and you're seeing things that are sort of, happen at the same time. That's not causal. That's just simply, maybe correlative or something else. But the point is that there are a lot of different ways to describe that, from just simply being associative to being causal. Causal being the hardest to prove. Let's see. And so they get a little bit more into comparisons with artificial neural network models, which I find really interesting because neural networks are, of course, people think of there are a lot of debates as to whether neural networks are, equivalent to what's going on in the brain. And so this is an interesting discussion on this. And then they have a lot more on things like sort of the Hebbian rules that we think of when we think of single neurons and how they connect to one another. Propagation and activation between neurons, which are, of course, important in neural networks, in artificial neural networks. And then you have other tools such as activity flow mapping, which is where you have these different regions that you identify with coarser grain methods, and there are ways to look at the flow of information between two nodes in these biological networks. And so I think they're trying to bring that together here in this paper. So that's that paper. I'm not going to get too much more into it. It looks like it goes on for a while. There's some nice figures in here, and I think if you choose to look at it, you'll get a lot out of it. So then this paper, behavioral signatures of a developing neural code, and this is this was from bioRxiv. I don't know what the date is. I think it's relatively recent. So this is actually something that I think might be useful to developmental Bratenberg vehicles. They talk about neural codes, which are how information is encoded in neural structures. So information from the environment, like a face or a location or some abstract concept like temperature or taste, how they're encoded in cells. And so we know that from Bratenberg vehicles that we don't really have a lot of representation in the vehicle part, in the neural network in the vehicle. But of course, this GSOC project that we're talking about doing is trying to develop a representation for that. And so one way that people have done this is through neural codes to explain how things are encoded in different cells and in networks. And so, but this is actually an interesting paper that talks about, in development, how these neural codes come to be. And so here we demonstrate a direct link between the maturity of neural coding in the visual brain and developmental changes in visually guided behavior. And so they look in zebrafish larvae, which are, of course, zebrafish are these, fish that have a brain, and zebrafish in particular are very easy to study because they're a model organism, so we can access their brains and their larvae pretty easily. We show that visually driven hunting behavior improves from 4 to 15 days post-fertilization, becoming faster and more accurate. During the same period, population activity in the optic tectum refines, leading to improved decoding and information transmission of spatial position, particularly in the representation of the frontal visual field. Remarkably, individual differences in decoding can predict each fish's hunting success. Together, these results show how the neural codes required to subserve a natural behavior emerge during development. So I guess they use some sort of electrical method for measuring brain activity. In this one, they don't use any. Well, I don't know if they might use imaging. Let's see, some form of imaging. So they use analysis of hunting behavior movies. So they actually use movies to record like the hunting behavior. So they actually take images and they extract the frames from the movies, and they analyze those images to characterize hunting behavior. And let's see. That's how they acquire the images. And then they compute. So a lot of this is like analyzing microscopy data, actually. Oh, okay, they use 2-photon calcium imaging. So they're actually, what that means is that they're looking at calcium activity in the neurons, and they're using this type of imaging. So they're using microscopy to capture images. They're not like bright field images like what we're used to seeing with, the more typical sort of gray-looking microscopy image, but they're using like something that gets, produces false color images that you see sometimes in some of the science articles on, like if you've ever seen things on, some of the brain science articles that come out, and you'll see these false color images. That's the kind of thing they're producing here. And they also have images like movies, which have like images of the fish, and so they can identify like the head position and things like that. So that's how they're measuring this. Then they're actually using some modeling here. They're looking at decoding stimulus identity. So they're using a model for that. They're using a model for information, an information theoretic model, looking at the mutual information between the stimulus variable and the activity of each neuron. And that's quite a bit of math there. So that's how they measure this, and they don't really have any figures in this paper, unfortunately. Not in this version. Maybe there's some figures offline, but so yeah, this is an interesting paper. I haven't gone through it all the way or considered the implications of it, but it might be useful to go through a little bit more detail, and maybe if there are other papers in this area, because it would be interesting to see how development affects like the formation of things like that in the brain. That might be useful for our purposes in modeling or thinking about how these things happen in development, how we get representations in development. So are there any questions on those papers, or I can give you a link to the repository of the papers. I think I've shared it.
I was going to ask for the link, yeah.
And if you don't have permissions, just send me a message or just request them. I think I made it open. So
Yeah.
there you go.
Best access.
So why don't we move on then to some of the other business. So the NeuroMatch Conference, as I told you last week, is this coming Monday and Tuesday. And it's an unconference. So it's being held online. So they have the website up, NeuroMatch.io. If you, let's see if I can put that in the chat. So I know Jessie knows all about this, but I don't know if Ankit does. So that's NeuroMatch.io, and they've got some of the schedule, like they have it scheduled now, so they have keynote speakers and all of that. And so this is non-conference in computational neuroscience, and so it's happening this Monday and Tuesday. The actual unconference, which is, so they have this thing where they match you with people if you request it, and you get like people who share your interests. And so then they sent me a list of people who were my matches yesterday. And so the idea is to meet with those people separately in this unconference, which is like whenever you decide between these dates to meet. So, and then of course the whole thing's going to be on Twitter. So NeuroMatch 2020 is the hashtag. And so they've accepted all the proposals. So that's what I learned yesterday. And the agenda is, let's see. Okay, so the agenda, it's interesting. They're doing this for a global audience. So they're starting at, let's see, GMT 10:45 a.m. And then that's the first keynote. And then it goes on to 12 a.m. GMT. So it's it straddles between North America and Europe in terms of time. So there's some times that are really early for people in North America, really late for people in Europe, and overnight for people in India. But they tried, I guess that's the best way they can do it, given the people who are presenting here. We have people from Europe, people from the US, Canada. So that's the main area. But I think all this will be recorded. I don't think it's going to be like, people are going to be excluded if they can't make these times. So they have the short talks and contributed talks, which are going to be like 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the category. And those are going to be in, I think the contributed talks will be in this Crowdcast, and the short talks will be in Zoom. And so that's what they're going to do. And then we don't know about the short talks and contributed talks yet. Who gets what?
Spool rack actually.
What was that?
I know about Russ Polrock. I mailed him this year.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have a lot of good names here. Like they have people like Blake Richards as a machine learning researcher, Yashua Bengio, but Russ Poljack, of course, is a psychology researcher. He does a lot of stuff with reproducibility. People like Conrad Cording, he does a lot of stuff with motor control and some other areas. So there's Daniel Bassett does a lot of stuff with networks. We were just talking about that. So it's going to be an interesting time. So the thing I wanted to get at as well is talk about the abstracts. And so I submitted an abstract this is actually based more on stuff from DevoWorm group that I do on a regular basis. And this is something I presented 2 years ago at a workshop, an NSF-sponsored workshop on biological modeling. So the idea for that workshop was to take biologists and modelers and bring them together. And so this was a version of this I gave at that workshop, and I'm going to give another one here. So this is processes connectivity. So this talks about complex networks both in connectomes and in anatomical structures. And so the question I'm asking here, does spatial connectivity provide inferential guidance in understanding the developing phenotype and nervous system? And then the answer may be found in both the embryo and the developmental origin of the connectome. And so I go through there are some papers associated with this that were published after I gave the first version of this talk. And I'm going to talk about some of that work. And then I'm going to talk about something else that's more along the lines of, we have models of complex networks, but are those really descriptive of what we're finding in these data? And so I'm going to go talk about that too. And so this is I think I'm done with it. Not sure. I'll have to go over it a little bit more this weekend, but so this is the processes connectivity. I talk about the DevoWorm group as a unique entity, modeling questions. So then I go into embryo networks, what those are. And I kind of go through some of those data. I kind of talk about connectomes and C. elegans and developmental connectomes. So we're able to extract information about the developmental connectome. So there's some maps here of like where these cells are in the adult. And then discussion about like complex networks and looking at the types of networks you get versus like, say, a random network. And so this just shows kind of the relative structure. And so then I talk about biological modeling and how models can oversimplify a biological system. So, we use models for things, and sometimes those models are not particularly informative because we try to oversimplify them, or we try to make them too general. And so we end up with this thing called what they call the spherical cow in physics. It's an old joke that's like they ask a physicist to model like crop yields in an economy, and then like the physicist says, well, first we have to assume a spherical world or something like that. I think no, that joke is actually something about like milk production, how to optimize milk production, and they say, well, first you assume a spherical cow. And so the idea is that the spherical cow doesn't exist. And so we're making up this construct that doesn't make any sense to start off the problem with. And so that's the idea. And so I link this actually to development. This is something we've talked about in DevaWorm, where in development you actually do have a spherical antecedent, which is the embryo. But there's a lot of differentiation in the embryo, and it becomes this asymmetric organism. So you're actually, you might make a spherical assumption for the embryo, and it might be actually better suited for that. But then when you're dealing with like actually development unfolding and becoming a real organism or a mature organism, then you're talking about something else, and maybe that model isn't very good anymore. And so my idea of the spherical cow is basically this type of complex network, this theory of complex networks where you have different types of networks that we're trying to compare against. And the idea is that in biological networks, maybe some of these network types are insufficient to describe the data. And so that's the idea there. I hope it like fits into the time allotted, and in terms of the ideas, like people getting my idea across in that time. So, Jessie.
Yes.
So, would you like to discuss your submission a little bit?
Yeah. I just looked again, actually, at the differentiated between basically it was like 12 or 18-minute talks.
Yeah.
And I haven't gotten yet that thing. I did get notified that I was accepted to present, which is nice. I don't know if I can share my screen on my phone like this. Well, I'll try to do this. Including this. Can you see my screen?
Oh, yeah.
This is essentially what it was, what one of the versions I submitted. I'm looking to change my abstract a little bit, but you can see essentially the title here. I'm essentially using our project and looking at layers of representation through it, and obviously what we've done so far isn't really representational, and what we're going to is what we want to do in this year's, with the complex geometric structures. But I wanted to kind of, that as just I'm going to use sort of that as a backdrop to discuss concepts in embodied cognition and going from like radical embodied cognition, which the most radical is essentially zero, like no representation, which fits kind of more with Valentino's original ideas in some of their forms, and some of the simpler versions of the context that the vehicles we made, and then kind of branching out as, okay, what creating kind of a spectrum of non-representation and relative behavioral complexity, or the potential for complexity behavior, and how different layers of representation can change that and go forward. So let me see if I can. Oh, I doesn't matter. That's generally what I wanted to do. I don't think I'll be able to show anything else. I have some slides that are in the work that are not done yet. So, but I think I'm going to keep it. I might even volunteer to one of the shorter talks, just because it's there's a lot that you could talk for quite a bit about it, but I'd rather have a simpler talk that's more about different ways to look at embodied cognition itself. And I don't know how much this will definitely dovetail with the proposal for Google Summer of Code well, but it's also a lot of the representational stuff isn't entirely there yet. So it's kind of bridging the gap of, okay, here's what we have, and here's what we might be doing, and here's what I might be doing, at least. But at the same time, I think it's better to just base it on the concepts of, variations in embodied cognition and potentially representation as well. So I feel good about it. I'm going to try to finish. I want to take a few more steps of my proposal first today, and then kind of finish my slides for that maybe tonight or tomorrow. But I'm actually very excited about the conference in general, because it's very timely and fits a lot of things. I wanted to ask, did you understand or get any more updates about how they mention presenting? The email that I got basically sounded like, oh, we don't really have set times. It's just going to be whenever you want to, but I didn't understand what that really meant.
Well, I think they're going to do. I think they're. It's yet to be decided when people are getting slots. I think they're going to send out, like, and I hope they do it soon, but like when people are available. So like you're going to fill out like a form that like tells what times you have available, and they'll kind of match people to that, because they're going to have a lot of people to go through and match with times. And then, if your time doesn't work, then you have to like reschedule. It's going to be I think they're going to do another round of, like, I guess they're going to try to find compatible talks and put them in the same session, and then times. So it's like a double scheduling problem where you have to have themes and then also available times, and that's always the trick of organizing a workshop or conference, is scheduling people, programming it. So it's always hard. But I think that's forthcoming before Monday.
And also just to preempt this, I probably will leave at 11 or maybe just slightly before 11. I have another meeting, but I definitely wanted to. I'll talk to you more about this on Slack for sure, so I can kind of go over my slide duty if you don't mind, and things like that.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I look forward to it, and we'll. Yeah, right. And then, let me know on Slack, and then hopefully we both do pretty well at the talk. Should be good.
Yeah, it seems like a really enjoyable conference, especially given everything else has been canceled or not really done right now. So I'm looking forward to it a lot, actually.
Yeah. Ankit, did you have any comments on either?
No, I have.
Okay.
I've submitted a proposal, and you can give your comments like you gave. So very happy with the idea that came out of the discussion some days ago with you. So yeah.
Yeah. So why don't we move on to the CSV conf talk, since Jessie's got to leave right at 11. So let me actually.
Yeah, sorry. There's a volunteer effort to 3D print some like PPE stuff
Oh,
at my
really?
university, and it's not really clear what's happening yet, but it's like the first, let's meet on Zoom or whatever to talk about it. And I'm kind of trying to help organize it in the sense that I think, I'm not organized, I shouldn't say that, I'm not organizing it at all. But I noticed that there wasn't the best marketing for it, if you will.
Yeah.
It was like an email, and like, this should be more than just an email. So I've tried to bring other people into the fold for it, and I don't have much more to say, but I kind of want to make sure that something functioning happens at least. So
Yeah, definitely.
anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So, well, good luck with that. Here's the presentation, and this isn't like due this week. Like I said, so by next week, we want to have a rough outline of what we want to address in this talk.
Yes. I'll definitely be adding more to this, like, after the end of the month, basically.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So this is the title slide, and then we have this. This is the abstract that was submitted. So we have some of these things in this will go like into slides. So we have origins in Web 1.0. That again, I think probably there's more to say there. A little bit about like other similar things. There are probably other examples that we can bring in or something to talk about with respect to this. Maybe like how things are laid out and sort of like how we might learn from examples like this where you had a directory almost like a traditional dictionary, but there's more to it than that. And so then we talk about knowledge spaces, and I'll talk about that a bit. I have this thing here, the particular topic. This is actually something I was calling an epistemological map. I didn't put the title on that, but I have to finish what I'm talking about. This is maybe a model of what, maybe one of this type of idea, how to maybe summarize this in the world of like knowledge. So it's like, we were talking before about what the minimal you need to know for a certain field. Sort of related to this. Then controlled vocabularies, which is a concept from data science, and I'll maybe get into that. Then frontier maps, of course, and this is Jessie's topic, so you have a couple of foci in the abstract. Then there's frontier maps, go back to the idea of minimal information for a field. You can add to that if how as you see fit. I'm just suggesting this reference. Then the data reuse initiative, which is something I wanted to plug. Well, we have 30 minutes for this, so I think we have enough time for everything. To really get into some depth on some of these ideas.
Yes.
And the reason I wanted to plug this was because it does have some relevance to like some of the stuff before it. We've been exploring some ideas in data reuse, and especially what they call the FAIR standards. So FAIR is it's findable, interoperable, or it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so the idea is to make your data set, if you put a data set up to share with your colleagues, that they have all of those properties. And then the question is, how do you do that? And so this seems a little tangential to what we're doing, but there is this aspect of like connecting it to topical domains. And so that actually fits within the FAIR standards to some extent. But, I don't know. That's something to think about. And this is, again, like, we want to bring up some things that are relevant to the broader community, but we also want to describe what we're doing. And so I think those bridges need to be made. And I think it resonates with like people like this a lot more if you do that. And then the cybernetic model. So this is just kind of like something that I was thinking of, like for an interdisciplinary view, can we actually propose a cybernetic model of like how does this get regulated? So how do people, when they look at these different topics, how do they put it all together? So I don't know if you agree with this, but like to create a general cybernetic model or something of interdisciplinarity, how can you facilitate people like going across these fields instead of this just being a collection of nodes on the web?
Yeah, I'm definitely curious about that. Are you proposing that's something that we talk about, or something that we like create an offer to them in the conference?
Well, maybe that would work. Maybe like how you end it. Sometimes you end a talk with like, this is a challenge for the community. Like because they're going to come away with it. They're going to say, okay, there are all these connections. How do we put them all together? And one way maybe is to say, we can think of this as a model of regulation. Like, this is how, instead of having a bunch of disembodied nodes, this is how we're going to put it all together eventually. Maybe not today, but like down the road. And, we can think of it as a model of regulation. I know there's a lot of stuff on, like, if you go into the social science literature, people talk about cybernetics and embodiment a lot with respect to education. So that might actually be something to think about, that connection. But
yes.
So, and I mean, I look forward, if you have an idea that you think is relevant, just put it on a slide. It doesn't have to be very developed, but just as a marker. And then, just keep like kind of thinking about how we can better organize it. If there's anything that you want to add or you think is superfluous or you think should be moved, just make a suggestion.
Okay. I will definitely be doing that this week.
Okay.
One thing I want to mention before I go,
Okay.
Did I mention the ICLR, the International Conference on Learning Representations last week? For anyone who's interested, I guess if Ankit is, or just to kind of move a general shout out for it, that's moved online, and they also have they're offering a volunteer opportunity for people to test their digital environments. So if anybody wants to go to the conference and not pay anything, they're waiving the fee if you volunteering to spend a couple hours, like 2 to 6 hours or something, testing the environment over the next week or 2 weeks or something like that. So that's a cool. I don't know. Actually, I kind of forgot to mention this over the other thing, but I put that I'm making a small list of things for ways people can volunteer about COVID-related stuff, especially for STEM people. I made a repo on GitHub about that. I'm just trying to compile some different things for that. So actually, that's going to be what I'm going to, and I'm going to leave down to do that. And the ICLRL thing isn't exactly that, but it's tangentially related. So for people who are either want to help with COVID or who basically are affected by conferences being digitalized and made canceled, all that stuff. But if there's any questions about that, message me in Slack. But I probably will go. If there's anything else you wanted me to comment on, or before I go?
No, you can just put the links in Slack, and we can probably discuss things after on Slack. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Then I'll do that. Thanks. Good to see everybody. I'll catch you guys next week.
All right. Catch you later.